Braveheart, movie versus history.
They may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom! Our freedom to reshape history however it suits our movie!
This could be a paraphrased version of William Wallace's iconic line from the Oscar-winning film Braveheart, starring Mel Gibson, because the cinematic story of the Scottish farmer and one of the main leaders of the independence uprising is considered one of the most historically inaccurate films in the history of cinema. Today, we'll look at some of the major ways the movie deviates from real history. In Braveheart, King Edward I of England institutes Jus Primae Noctis in Scotland, a law that allows English lords to take the virginity of newlywed Scottish brides on their wedding night. According to the film, this was a strategy to suppress Scottish birth rates and bring the country under tighter English control by filling it with English heirs rather than pure-blooded Scots. However, there is no evidence such a practice ever occurred in Scotland, or anywhere else for that matter. Most historians believe the idea of Jus Primae Noctis was likely a literary or political metaphor used to highlight a ruler's oppressive power rather than a real legal practice. Still, it's a popular trope in books and movies. The most famous battle in Braveheart, the first major clash between the Scots and the English, is the Battle of Stirling Bridge. While the film features one of the most brutal depictions of medieval warfare, complete not only with English longbowmen and Wallace wielding a massive greatsword, but also with bare Scottish behinds, it gets two major facts wrong. First, the absence of Scottish commander Andrew de Moray, who launched an uprising in northern Scotland in 1297 and later joined forces with Wallace near the town Dundee. Together they marched to Stirling. Second, and most notably, the film omits the bridge. Yes, the Stirling Bridge. The battle took place on a narrow bridge over the River Forth, not on an open field. The real Scottish forces, though fewer in number and equipment, used the bridge to their advantage. Only 2 horsemen could cross it side by side, so they waited until a sufficient number of English troops had crossed, then attacked. Many English died, and the rest fled or drowned. The English still outnumbered the Scots, but their commander, John de Warenne, lost his nerve, ordered the bridge destroyed, and retreated. The film's version swaps this clever tactical ambush for a battle style more akin to Bannockburn, where Robert the Bruce later secured Scottish independence, likely because filming on a bridge posed too many logistical challenges. At the beginning of Braveheart, William Wallace is portrayed as a poor, dirty boy dressed in sackcloth, living in a thatched cottage. In reality, not much is known about Wallace's early life, but it is established that he came from a lower noble family, and his father, Alan Wallace, was a knight. William likely received a good education and military training. Contrary to the film, his father and brother did not die fighting the English while he was a child. In fact, Wallace was already an adult when tensions with the English peaked. Also, he wasn't a Highlander, but a lowlander of Anglo-Norman descent, just like many of his English adversaries. During the funeral of Wallace's father and brother in the film, mournful melodies are played on bagpipes. Wallace's uncle tells him the tunes are forbidden, as is the instrument. While bagpipes were indeed banned in the 18th century during the campaign of King George II of Great Britain to assimilate the Scottish Highlands and dismantle the clan system, they were not forbidden in the 13th or 14th centuries. Wallace's iconic greatsword in the film, which mysteriously appears and disappears and is briefly replaced by a warhammer, is based on a type of sword that originated in the late 16th century. The real-life inspiration is the so-called Wallace sword, displayed at the National Wallace Monument in Stirling, said to have belonged to William Wallace. However, a closer inspection revealed it consists of 3 parts, and only the lowest section might date back to the 13th century. So, it's possible, though unlikely, That part of it was Wallace's actual sword. Two-handed swords didn't really appear until the 15th century and became widespread in the 16th. Whether or not you believe in the authenticity is up to you. While the film's title, Braveheart, refers to William Wallace, the nickname was actually attributed to Robert the Bruce. According to chronicler John Barber, Bruce regretted never going on a crusade, so he made Sir James Douglas, also known as the Black Douglas, swear to carry his heart into battle after his death. Douglas placed Bruce's heart in a silver casket and took it to Spain, where he joined the King Alfonso XI of Castile in a campaign against the Moors. During the siege of the fortress at Teba, Douglas and his men were cut off from the main Christian force and ambushed. Realizing his end was near, Douglas allegedly threw the casket containing Bruce's heart and shouted, "Go forward, Braveheart. Douglas will follow you or die." In Braveheart, Robert the Bruce is unflatteringly portrayed as a Scottish noble who repeatedly betrays William Wallace under pressure from his dying father, all to advance his own status in the power struggle among the Scottish nobility. Although Wallace does not ultimately hold a grudge against him, and Robert receives his redemption arc, leading the Scots to victory at the Battle of Bannockburn against King Edward II, the historical truth is quite different. Neither Robert nor his father fought against Wallace at the Battle of Falkirk. In fact, they supported the Scottish cause. As shown in the film, they may have even helped Wallace escape. Robert the Bruce had nothing to do with Wallace's betrayal or his eventual execution. On the contrary, the Bruce family were among Wallace's key allies and caused problems for the English in southwest Scotland. Although it's not confirmed whether Robert was present at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, many believe he may have been the highest-ranking noble who knighted Wallace after the victory. While Robert did submit to King Edward I in 1302, he later returned to the Scottish cause, was crowned king, and ultimately led the army that defeated a much larger English force at Bannockburn. He liberated Scotland and secured his position. Robert the Bruce is considered a national hero in Scotland. In the movie Braveheart, Isabelle is portrayed as a French princess married to Prince Edward II of England. The marriage is unhappy. Edward shows no interest in her, preferring to spend time with his companion and probable lover, Philip. King Edward I then sends Isabelle to negotiate with Wallace. After a few meetings, they fall in love, sleep together, and she later becomes pregnant with Wallace's child, who, the film implies, becomes the future king. Saying that out loud makes it sound far-fetched even by Hollywood standards. In reality, Isabelle was still in France at the time of Wallace's execution, and she was only 10 years old. Quite a difference from 28-year-old Sophie Marceau, who portrayed her in the film. Isabelle married Edward II when she was 12. Their marriage was also troubled, but it was at least fruitful. They had a son, the future King Edward III, and 3 other children. Eventually, Isabelle deposed her husband in favour of their son. Some legends claim that it was not Isabelle, but Margaret, the young wife of Edward I and stepmother to Edward II, who may have had secret meetings with Wallace. But legends are, after all, just legends. In the film, Wallace's wife is named Murren, but according to a 15th century poem by Harry the Minstrel, her real name was Marian. The filmmakers changed the name to avoid confusion with Maid Marian from Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, which had come out just 4 years earlier. The film also dramatizes their relationship. In reality, Marian's death was not the reason Wallace started his rebellion. In one version of the story, William and Marian fell in love in Lanark, but decided not to marry until Scotland was freed from English rule. In another, they married secretly and even had a daughter. They lived separately to avoid drawing attention. Wallace reportedly visited her in secret until one Sunday after Mass, when he got into a confrontation with English soldiers and decapitated one of them. He and other Scots then killed around 50 soldiers before retreating to Marian's home. The town sheriff, Heselrig, who had previously killed Marian's father and brother, came to the house demanding their surrender. Marian tried to delay him so Wallace could escape, but the sheriff's men broke in and killed her. Wallace escaped, but returned that night and killed the sheriff with a single downward sword strike, splitting his head to the collarbone. Wallace's execution was actually far worse than portrayed in the film. After being captured, he was charged with treason and sentenced to die in a brutal fashion. First, he was stripped naked and dragged behind a horse through the streets of London while the crowd jeered. At the execution site, he was hanged, but just before he lost consciousness, the rope was cut to prolong the agony. Still alive, his genitals were cut off, and his intestines pulled out and burned before his eyes. He was then beheaded and his body quartered. His head was dipped in tar and placed on a spike on London Bridge as a warning. The 4 quarters of his body were sent to Stirling, Aberdeen, Berwick, and Newcastle, places Edward believed might inspire future rebellion. Contrary to the film, he likely didn't scream "freedom" during the execution. He probably had other things on his mind. During his trial, he claimed he could not be a traitor, as he had never sworn allegiance to the English crown and would never do so while he lived. Though the film suggests he was offered a swift death if he begged for mercy, no such offer was actually made. While the blue face paint worn by Wallace and his warriors in the film looks visually striking, historically the Scots did not paint their faces in this way. It had gone out of fashion roughly 1,000 years earlier. The filmmakers took inspiration from the Picts, a people who lived in what is now central and northern Scotland during early Roman invasions of Caledonia. The term Pict comes from the Latin picti, meaning painted. The Picts used body paint and tattoos for decoration and resisted Roman rule, eventually forming a kingdom that lasted until the 9th century. There is also no evidence that medieval Scots wore braided or dreadlocked hairstyles adorned with fur or other decorations, as shown in the film. Just as Braveheart borrowed painted faces from the distant past, it borrowed Scotland's iconic kilts from the future. Mentions of kilts didn't appear in historical records until the late 16th century, by which time sheep had become the primary livestock in the region, and wool had become widespread. The film Braveheart is set in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, but kilts were used in the movie because they had become a cultural symbol deeply tied to Scotland. Before kilts, Scots wore the same as most other Northern Europeans. This garment was called a len, a long tunic resembling a shirt, made from linen because it was affordable and readily available. Laine were often dyed yellow using horse urine or, later, saffron, and remained common until sheep farming made wool more accessible. Another wardrobe inaccuracy in the film is the standardized look of the English soldiers. In reality, there were numerous groups with varied armor and clothing, so not everyone would have looked the same. In Braveheart, King Edward II is portrayed as an effeminate, weak, impotent man who prefers the company of men, particularly his companion Philip, to women. While he did have several male favorites, there's no historical evidence their relationships were romantic. Moreover, Edward had 4 children, including a possible illegitimate son and a suspected affair with his niece, Eleanor de Clare. Despite this, Edward II was unpopular, largely because he granted noble titles to commoners, which led to unrest and his eventual deposition. As already mentioned regarding Princess Isabella, the film Braveheart plays very loosely with historical chronology. The film opens in 1276, during the reign of Alexander III of Scotland, when England was not yet making aggressive moves towards Scotland. After Alexander's death, John Balliol ruled as King of Scotland, during which Edward I of England exploited concessions to undermine Scottish sovereignty. In 1296, Edward invaded Scotland and deposed King John. The following year, William Wallace and Andrew de Moray led a resistance, ultimately defeating the English at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Also, King Edward the Fern did not die during Wallace's execution, but several years later from dysentery, south of the Scottish border. A notable omission from the film's script is Wallace's close friend, Sir John de Graham, who died at the Battle of Falkirk. Instead, we are introduced to Hamish Campbell, Wallace's fictional childhood friend and later right-hand man after the Battle of Stirling Bridge. And speaking of the Battle of Falkirk, it too didn't happen as shown in the film. When the English entered Scotland, Wallace initially avoided direct confrontation, but eventually the armies clashed. The Scots stood in tight schiltron formations, defensive circles of spears, and repelled several English cavalry charges. The English then used their longbows to devastating effect. The movie Braveheart gets one thing right. The Scottish cavalry did indeed abandon the battlefield, but no one knows why. The film suggests they were bribed, but many of the Scottish nobles were deeply loyal to the cause and likely withdrew after realizing there was no chance of victory. And so ends the most likely truth behind the story of William Wallace. What do you think about the differences between the film and history? Does it change how you feel about this otherwise undeniably epic film? Let us know in the comments.